Brandon Hoyt's laugh echoed through the marble atrium like a goddamn stock split announcement. "Let the lawyers clean it up," he said, slicking his hair back with the kind of arrogance you can't buy, only inherit. That was the first thing I heard when I stepped off the elevator that morning. And I already knew this smug little shit had never read a single page of the merger agreement. Not one. But he was about to be handed control of the biggest deal our firm had ever touched, and nobody, not the board, not the founders, not even Alaris, had the spine to stop it. Miles stood just behind the glass wall of Conference B, shoulders forward, coffee cooling in his hand, watching it all unfold like it was a courtroom drama he'd seen rerun too many times. Same script, different CEO, he didn't say a word, didn't move. You could walk past him a dozen times and not realize you were in the presence of the most brilliant legal mind in that building. He didn't correct people when they mispronounced his name. He didn't chase titles. He didn't schmooze. Miles Renner just built structures so legally tight they made God flinch. The 3,000-page contract he'd been quietly assembling over the past 18 months wasn't just airtight. It was weaponized. And before I go on, if you're listening to this and haven't hit subscribe yet, do it. I swear, 97% of folks tune in without subscribing, and it really keeps our team going. Hit like, too. It helps way more than you think. Anyway, I remember the exact moment I realized Brandon didn't even understand what we were merging into. He swaggered into a pre-close alignment call, late, chewing gum, holding court like he was auditioning for a TED Talk. "Can someone give me the Twitter version of the merger docs? I don't have time for bedtime reading." He chuckled at his own joke. I watched Miles blink. Once. Then he reached for his yellow legal pad and scribbled something in the margin. I didn't see it then, but that moment, right there, that was when everything turned. The thing about Miles is he doesn't react. He preempts. While the rest of us were trying to decode Brandon's buzzwords and pretend like the firm hadn't just been hijacked by a legacy brat with a Rolex and a vendetta against process, Miles was playing the long game. No celebration, no complaints. He just kept working until the close packet was thicker than a phone book and 4 times as dangerous. The Alaris execs weren't idiots. They'd dealt with cowboys before. But even they didn't grasp what Miles had truly done until much, much later. At the time, they loved him. Quiet type, one of them told me at the merger dinner. But he sees the whole board. They meant chess, not management. They weren't wrong. Miles didn't show up to the dinner, of course. He never did. I saw his name on the seating chart and his place card on the table next to me, untouched, pristine. Instead, I found him 2 floors up, still in his office, unwrapping a turkey sandwich like nothing monumental had just happened. I asked him if he wanted me to box him some dessert. He just smiled and said, "I prefer a clean close." What I didn't know then, and what none of us knew really, was that tucked in Section 82, buried under transitional indemnities and cross-jurisdictional harmonization language, was a clause so obscure you'd need a map, flashlight, and 3 certifications to find it. But it was there, sitting like a landmine, addendum C-17, and it had a trigger, a very specific, deliberate trigger. All it needed was Brandon. Brandon strutted across the stage at the final merger announcement like he was headlining Coachella, all swagger and veneers, arms spread wide to welcome the press, the partners, and the bootlickers who'd spent the last 6 months laughing at his jokes. "Today marks a new chapter," he said into the mic, teeth gleaming under the stage lights. "A leaner, faster, smarter Kessler-Ilaris alliance. None of it would have been possible without this incredible executive team." The crowd applauded. Cameras flashed. And one by one, Brandon rattled off names like he was reading a LinkedIn feed of people who only showed up to pose for quarterly reports. Not once did he mention Miles Renner. I was standing near the back, sipping lukewarm coffee and watching Miles out of the corner of my eye. He didn't flinch, didn't fold his arms, didn't even sigh. He just kept flipping through the final printed merger packet like he was proofreading scripture. But I could see the page numbers weren't changing. He wasn't reading. He was waiting, letting the insult settle, like dust on polished marble. Later that afternoon, Brandon shut the conference room door behind him with a smug little snap and slid into a leather chair across from 2 of our junior attorneys. I was sitting in on the meeting under the guise of logistics. but mostly just to make sure someone didn't accidentally commit a felony out of sheer ignorance. Brandon leaned forward, hands steepled like a game show villain. We're going to move the Hoyt family trust assets into a cleaner bucket. Something the new entity doesn't touch. Can't have the board sniffing around our legacy holdings. The younger lawyer raised an eyebrow. That would require navigating the consolidated asset disclosure terms. Post-merger, those funds might fall under shared stewardship unless properly documented before close. Brandon smirked like he'd just been handed a participation trophy. Miles buried this place in red tape for years. I'm not asking for permission. I'm asking you to make it look clean. They hesitated. He added, "Let me rephrase. I'm the CEO now. Make it clean." He never asked where the boundaries were. He just assumed anything not nailed down was his to repackage. The trust wasn't even part of the merger, on paper. But the moment it touched the new entity's infrastructure, even indirectly, it became a compliance nightmare. Miles knew that. Hell, Miles built that. That night, I passed Miles in the hallway. He was locking his filing cabinet with the same precision he always used, like each drawer held a nuclear code. "You catch the speech?" I asked, trying to keep it light. He paused just long enough to let the silence bite. Every CEO has a first day. I almost asked him what he meant, but he was already gone, walking down the hall with his coat slung over one arm, a ghost in his own firm. Not angry, not defeated, just moving with a kind of stillness that makes you feel like something's about to break and you won't even hear it coming. The next morning, Brandon called a follow-up meeting. Same room, same power pose. This time he had a private wealth advisor in tow, some smirking Malibu transplant who said fiduciary like it was foreplay. They started talking shell companies, Belize, Jersey, layered holdings, and I watched as Brandon waved off every mention of compliance protocols like they were allergies he'd outgrown. "We're not laundering money," he snapped. "We're protecting legacy assets. Miles just didn't get it. That's why he's not here anymore." He hadn't fired him yet. Not yet. But you could feel it in the air. Brandon wasn't just ignoring Miles. He was circling him, measuring him, treating him like a dusty filing cabinet no one had bothered to throw out yet. And Miles, as always, said nothing. That's when I realized Brandon wasn't playing defense. He thought he was the storm. And Miles, he was the fuse. It happened at 8:14 a.m. sharp, which told me two things. Brandon didn't have the guts to do it in front of a full office, and he didn't trust Miles enough to wait until after coffee. His assistant, a wide-eyed finance intern named Rory, who always looked like he was one coffee away from vomiting, knocked on Miles's door like he was delivering a summons. "He wants to see you," Rory muttered, not meeting his eyes. "Right now." Miles didn't ask who he was. He just rose from his chair, slipped his pen into the crease of the contract packet he'd been annotating, and adjusted his cuff like he was heading into a dentist appointment he'd already accepted would hurt. I followed behind at a distance, not to eavesdrop, but because I couldn't not. Something was humming in the air like tension before a fuse blows. Brandon was waiting in the corner conference room, arms crossed, standing instead of sitting like it gave him authority. He grinned like a frat boy who'd finally memorized the rules of poker. "Miles," he said, drawing the name out, "you've served your purpose." Miles blinked, slow and calm. Brandon stepped forward, slipping a single-page document across the glass table with an unnecessary flourish. "Effective immediately. You're out. No bad blood. We just need to modernize our legal strategy." No anger, no scene. Miles glanced at the paper, nodded once, and said, "I'd like a copy for my records. Signed." Brandon chuckled. "Of course. HR's got the boilerplate ready. Nothing personal." To anyone watching, it would have looked surgical, polite, even humane, but I caught it. The tiniest flicker behind Miles's eyes. Not rage, not even sadness. Just a dull confirmation of something he'd already seen coming. He didn't ask for a meeting. He didn't argue for his seat. He just pocketed the termination letter like it was a train ticket and walked out. Brandon waited until the door clicked shut before turning to Rory with that smirk he probably practiced in mirrors. "Now," he said, "we can finally move some real money around without legal babysitters throwing up flags every 10 minutes. Rory laughed. Awkward. High-pitched. The kind of laugh you give when someone just committed career arson and expects applause. I stayed in the hall a few extra seconds, heart thudding like a war drum. Not because Miles had been fired. That part was practically a prophecy. But because the way he walked out, it wasn't defeat. It was too quiet, too calm, like he wasn't leaving a building. He was lighting a fuse on his way out and didn't want anyone to notice the spark. By noon, the announcement went live. Internal bulletin, sterile as a lab note. We thank Miles Renner for his years of service and wish him the best in future endeavors. No mention of the fact that the man had architected the very contract that had just closed the biggest merger in our firm's history. No farewell lunch, no handshake photo for the alumni newsletter, just a vacuum. One partner, an older guy from the Zurich office, replied to the thread with a single line. Who's handling his post-close compliance protocols? No one responded, because no one had a clue. I walked past Miles's office later that day, empty, silent, but his chair was turned slightly to the left, facing the window like it always did when he was thinking, and on his desk, right in the center, was a single yellow sticky note, blank, but positioned with precision, like a message only one person would understand. And that person, unfortunately for Brandon, was now gone, by choice. But not really. It was a Thursday night, 2 weeks before close. Everyone else had gone home. You could hear the janitor's radio echoing faintly through the ventilation ducts, Springsteen or maybe Sager, something with gravel and regret. Miles sat alone in conference room 4A, sleeves rolled, tie undone, the overhead fluorescents buzzing like gnats around truth. He wasn't reviewing documents anymore. He was carving a scalpel into the merger's anatomy. I'd brought him a cup of coffee and paused in the doorway when I saw the screen. It wasn't the main merger contract. It was a supplemental filing, buried under 6 levels of nested folders labeled with innocuous names like Reorg Logistics, Phase 3. But the title on the screen was unmistakable. Renner Addendum C-17 Executed Draft. He didn't look up. He just nodded once and said, "Close the door behind you." Addendum C-17 wasn't flashy. It didn't scream. It whispered. It lived in the interstitial tissue of the merger, between the holding company's structuring logic and the compliance overlay that Ilaris had insisted on during week 11 of negotiations. On the surface, it looked like a minor legal adjustment, an alignment clause if anyone bothered to ask, but it had teeth. Hidden, deliberate, irreversible teeth. The premise was simple. If a signatory architect of the merger agreement, that would be Miles, was removed without cause post-signature, and any transfer of trust or intrafamily assets occurred within the 30-day compliance cooling period, those assets would be subject to provisional stewardship by the parent entity, Ilaris Holdings International. In English, fire Miles unjustly, move family money through any structure not pre-documented, and you hand temporary control of those funds to the people Brandon hated most, the Ilaris board. Miles had spent months designing the framework Ilaris insisted on, clean lines of reporting, risk-layered holdings, and an uncrackable firewall around conflicts of interest. He knew Brandon's ego wouldn't allow him to stick to the map, so he turned the map into a trap. One clause, one condition, one hair trigger mechanism dressed in boring legalese. Any non-declared intrafamilial fund migration involving legacy assets previously excluded from pre-close escrow inventory shall, upon activation of Clause 17, fall under provisional oversight by the parent entity's internal compliance arm, pending dispute resolution and legal recharacterization. No one reads that. No one wants to read that. Which is why Brandon never did. The genius wasn't just in the clause, it was in how it hid. Miles anchored it to a cross-reference in an unrelated section on charitable rollover language. You'd only find it if you were tracing the full flow of asset disclosures across all addenda, which, let's be honest, no one in Brandon's camp was ever going to do. Ilaris had signed off on it, of course. Their lawyers saw it as an internal safeguard. Something to ensure the post-merger trust transfers wouldn't blindside their board. It was logical, predictable, entirely uninteresting. But to Miles, it was more than that. It was insurance, not for himself, but for the work. Because when you spend your life building systems that arrogant men think they can bend, eventually you stop trying to argue. You just build a switch and wait for them to flip it. I remember asking him that night, why put all that effort into a clause no one will notice? He looked at me, calm, tired, and more precise than I'd ever seen him, and said, because people like Brandon always find the cord to trip over. You just have to make sure it's connected to the right current. He closed his laptop. And just like that, C-17 was live, fully embedded, signed by all parties, approved by both boards, waiting, not for justice, for timing. Brandon's downfall started not with a bang, but with a ping. A small, colorless alert deep inside Alaris's financial compliance system. An automated trigger that flagged an unusual fund movement out of a high-value Hoyt trust account into a newly registered vehicle in the Cayman Islands. To Brandon, it was just Tuesday. To the software Miles helped structure, it was a goddamn fire drill. The wealth manager, a guy named Garrett Latham, who wore loafers with no socks and spoke like every word was a favor, had confidently initiated the transfer that morning, pushing just over $300 million in layered disbursements through 3 holding subsidiaries. It was designed to look clean, look separate, look invisible. But there was a problem. One of the routing numbers tripped a post-merger subroutine embedded in the compliance architecture, an obscure recursive check nested in the section Miles had labeled Dynamic Consolidation Filters. It wasn't meant to stop the transaction. It was meant to notice it, and then notify the right people. Within 12 minutes, the alert hit the inbox of Leanne Drake, Alaris's lead compliance auditor in New York. 5 minutes after that, it was flagged for legal review. 2 more minutes, and the general counsel's office was looped in. By lunchtime, there were 3 words being whispered on encrypted Slack channels and internal legal group chats. Clause C-17. No one had touched it since the signing. Most of the junior staff didn't even know it existed. But the moment the audit system matched the transaction to a list of non-declared legacy asset flows, a red flag was launched. It cross-checked signatory logs. It matched timestamps. It triangulated Brandon's termination letter to Miles, issued 2 days prior, and confirmed the trigger conditions. And just like that, the clause activated. Not publicly, not with sirens, but silently, systemically. From that moment forward, the trust assets were no longer solely under Hoyt control. They had legally entered a provisional state, governed, temporarily and contractually, by Alaris's parent holding structure. Garrett had no idea. Brandon was on a boat. Literally. He was on a yacht off the coast of Miami taking selfies with a crypto influencer and a bottle of rosé shaped like a machine gun. Meanwhile, back in the Manhattan office, the general counsel for Alaris, J. Malcolm Rowe, a former SEC prosecutor with a voice like burnt leather, sat down in a closed-door meeting with Leanne and 3 audit officers. They spread out the paperwork like a crime scene. Leanne tapped her pen on the transaction log. This transfer meets all the criteria. Non-disclosed, post-signature, initiated within the cooling period. And, she added, flipping the appendix, initiated 2 days after this. She held up a printed copy of Brandon's termination letter to Miles. Rowe didn't even blink. Clause C-17 is active, he said. A pause. One of the auditors asked the room, should we notify Hoyt Holdings? Rowe shook his head. Not yet. They'll know soon enough. Instead, he instructed the team to begin the temporary stewardship process, as outlined in the merger's risk control terms. The trust accounts were now in lockdown, legally compliant, invisible to Brandon, but very, very real. Somewhere between the third mimosa and a drone photo on Brandon's Instagram story, the storm began to form behind him. Slow, relentless, and absolutely by design. Miles didn't need revenge. He needed friction. He built a system where every selfish act had weight, and Brandon had just leaned into it. Brandon woke up late the next morning, groggy and sunburned, his phone buzzing like it owed him money. 10 missed calls, 4 voicemails, 2 texts from his private banker, both marked urgent. Still half drunk, he swiped open his banking app, expecting the usual 7 figures split across trust accounts, investment vehicles, personal burn funds, and the legacy reserve he liked to flaunt at golf retreats. What he saw instead was a 0. No error message, no glitch, just a long, clean line of zeros across every trust-linked balance. He sat up, blinked, closed the app, reopened it. Still zero. His thumb hovered over the screen as if the right combination of taps might unbreak reality. Another call came through, this time from Garrett Latham, the wealth manager, voice cracking with the kind of panic you only hear when someone's about to lose a license. "Brandon, we have a situation, a serious one. The trust, it's been flagged, frozen, legally. Alaris initiated provisional custody through something called Addendum C-17. Brandon cut him off. "What the hell is that? What do you mean Alaris has custody? I'm still trying to piece it together, but it's in the merger agreement, post-termination trigger clauses. It looks like when you fired Renner." Brandon hung up. 20 minutes later, he blew through the glass doors of the legal floor like a hurricane in a Rolex, demanding someone explain why 3 generations of Hoyt wealth had suddenly gone off-grid. Staff scattered. Interns stared. One poor junior counsel, Michael, I think, was ambushed in the hallway and frog-marched into the main boardroom like a sacrificial lamb. Brandon slammed a folder onto the table. "Fix it. Now." Michael fumbled with his laptop, beads of sweat already blooming at his collar. "Sir, the issue, it's in the final agreement. It's clause C-17. You triggered it." "Triggered what?" Michael scrolled, voice shaky. "When you terminated Renner without cause and then attempted to relocate non-disclosed intrafamilial assets within the 30-day compliance window, the clause activated. Per the language of the merger, any qualifying funds are to be held under provisional stewardship by Alaris until all conditions of dispute resolution are met." Brandon just stared at him. Michael, likely fearing for his job or his life, kept reading. "It's legal. It's signed. It was approved by both boards pre-close and it's binding." Brandon's face drained of color. "It's our money." Michael didn't move. "It's my family's legacy." No one spoke. He spun on his heel, stormed down the corridor toward the executive suite, barking into his phone, demanding someone get Miles Renner on the line, as if Miles was just some misplaced paralegal who forgot to CC him. But Miles didn't answer. Of course he didn't, because Miles wasn't coming back. And the system he left behind didn't negotiate. It didn't take phone calls. It just followed the rules. Brandon spent the rest of the morning in his office, glass of bourbon in hand, pacing like a man who'd just realized the fire escape was actually a locked closet. Calls were made, threats were issued, lawyers huddled in silence, flipping pages they should have read a week earlier. Every door Brandon pounded on led to the same sentence, spoken by people far calmer than him. "We are operating within the bounds of the agreement." His father's money, his family's investments, the properties, the offshore ventures, all parked, all pending, all locked behind a clause he never saw coming because he never thought anyone below him could write something worth noticing. But Miles had written it. Quietly. Elegantly. And now Brandon was trapped inside it. The emergency board meeting was called within hours. Calendar invites dropped like mortar fire. Subject: urgent. Alaris asset custody discussion. No agenda. No context, just a 10-minute lead time and a whole lot of nerves. When I stepped into the room, I could feel it. The air was thick, not with drama, but with the quiet dread that only lawyers and legacy money can summon. Half the partners looked like they hadn't slept. The CFO looked like he'd aged a decade overnight. Brandon stormed in late, red-faced and wide-eyed like someone had stolen his yacht. Which, to be fair, wasn't that far off. He launched into a rant before his chair even stopped spinning. "This is a coordinated overreach. Alaris has hijacked our assets under false pretenses. We're being ambushed through a technicality. We need an injunction. We need federal oversight. Hell, we need a damn war room." No one interrupted. He slapped a printed balance sheet on the table. 300 million. Frozen. Gone. Do you know what this does to our liquidity models? Our investment leverage? That's when the screen at the far end of the boardroom flickered to life. And Jay. Malcolm Rowe, Alaris's general counsel, appeared in split screen, every inch the ex-SEC bulldog he was rumored to be. Salt and pepper hair, pressed suit, calm as a glacier. "Good morning," he said flatly. "Alaris Holdings International is executing its rights under the contractual stewardship provision of Clause C-17, which was activated per the agreed-upon triggers outlined in the final merger contract." Brandon leaned toward the mic like a man on trial. You don't own that money. Rowe didn't blink. We're not claiming ownership. We are asserting custodial control per the agreement's terms. The trust assets were relocated post-termination of a signatory architect, without proper documentation, within the restricted compliance window. Your firm's signature, along with ours, ratified this clause. It is enforceable. The room went still. One of the partners, Chambers, old school, white hair, still reads contracts on paper, leaned forward and tapped the tabletop with a pen. Who, he asked slowly, added this clause? A pause. Everyone turned toward legal, specifically toward Michael, the same junior counsel who'd been ambushed by Brandon that morning. He was sitting 2 seats down from me, clutching a folder like it might save him from spontaneous combustion. He cleared his throat, flipped to the signatory appendix at the back of the merger binder, and read aloud. Clause C-17, drafted, reviewed, and authorized by Emsa Renner, senior legal architect. You could have heard a mouse breathing. Another partner, a woman from Zurich with eyes like a hawk, tilted her head. Miles Renner? Michael nodded. Chambers furrowed his brow. Renner, you mean the guy Brandon fired 2 days ago? No one answered. Brandon scoffed, trying to reassert dominance. He was dead weight, a glorified contract librarian. He buried this firm in bureaucracy. Rowe interjected, voice calm but sharp. He also built the compliance structure that prevented 3 class action lawsuits and allowed Alaris to finalize its offshore integration without SEC scrutiny. So I'd suggest choosing a more accurate descriptor. The silence thickened. What started as panic was curdling into something more dangerous, doubt. I looked around the table and saw it settling into their faces. This creeping realization that Brandon had underestimated someone critical, that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't an ambush at all. It was a reaction, a contract doing exactly what it had been designed to do by someone they'd all ignored. Miles didn't need a chair at that table to dominate it. He'd already been there. Through every footnote, every routing clause, every damn line of defense that Brandon had skipped over like a terms of service agreement. The board didn't say much after that. They didn't have to. The room wasn't asking if Brandon had screwed up anymore. They were starting to wonder how long it would take for the consequences to finish echoing. Brandon spent the next 48 hours dialing every legal contact he had, demanding miracle reversals like he was ordering drive-through. But it didn't matter how loud he shouted or how many cease and desists he waved around like holy water. No one could untrigger Clause C-17. It had already metastasized. Alaris's internal counsel sent a neatly bullet-pointed response within the day. The $300 million in question had been rerouted, not frozen, not vanished, but restructured. Thanks to a provision baked into the compliance plan, the assets had been legally converted into a tax-advantaged equity mechanism earmarked for Alaris's R&D innovation pipeline. The paper trail was clean. The transfer was complete. The money no longer lived in a vault. It lived in valuation. And per the merger contract, which, yes, Brandon had signed, any attempt to reverse the stewardship required joint board arbitration, followed by binding federal review. In plain terms, it would take years, with no guarantee, and every quarter that passed, the assets would be tied up in programs with matching co-investment requirements, diluting their retrievability even further. He tried throwing money at the problem. Called in a white shoe law firm, one of those alphabet names that charge $100 an hour just to warm up. They ran the clause through every legal model they had. Their final verdict? Ironclad. I saw Brandon that evening through the smoked glass wall of his corner office. Lights off, blinds half drawn, suit jacket on the floor. He sat slumped on the edge of the credenza like he didn't recognize the building anymore. The phone lay on the carpet, receiver blinking silently. He didn't bother picking it up. Up to that point, Brandon had always worn arrogance like armor, tight, polished, impenetrable, but now it hung off him like a borrowed coat. His confidence wasn't just shaken, it was gone, hollowed out by the one thing he never thought could touch him, the fine print. The next morning, the board woke to an email. No header, no subject line, just a name in the sender field, M. Renner. It was short. 2 paragraphs. He thanked the board for their time at Kessler and Hoyt, expressed no bitterness about his termination, and wished them well during the transition. Then came the last line. While I have no interest in returning to the firm, I am available for limited advisory support under standard consulting terms, should you require assistance navigating the structural protections outlined in the Alaris merger. No pitch, no gloating, just facts. The board forwarded it without comment. Brandon never replied. But I saw the assistant GC forward the email to herself, then immediately draft a calendar invite labeled Renner Consult, Preliminary Scope. The board knew what Brandon wouldn't admit. The firm's future didn't rest in his spreadsheets or yacht club charm. It was embedded in the clauses he never read, authored by the man he'd called a librarian. The empire Brandon inherited had new management now. Its laws weren't written in marble. They were written in margin notes. And Miles Renner's handwriting was all over it. By the following Monday, the press had blood in the water. The first headline came from a finance blog that usually stuck to ETF trends and hedge fund gossip. Merger clause implodes Hoyt Trust, 300 Nilesers in limbo as new CEO fumbles rollout. 12 hours later, it hit the front page of the Journal. The footnote that cost a fortune, Brandon Hoyt's $300 million mistake. They ate it up. Every paper, every podcast, every finance bro with a ring light and a Twitter thread. Suddenly, they were all dissecting the merger like it was a crime scene. Diagrams, timelines, side-by-sides of Brandon on his yacht versus Brandon outside the courthouse in a wrinkled blazer. One outlet even mocked up a fake legal drama poster. Clause C-17, the fine print that fought back. It trended for 2 days. In the official statement, Kessler and Hoyt didn't even pretend to spin it. Just a dry press release stamped with board approval. Effective immediately, Brandon Hoyt has stepped down as CEO to focus on restructuring family asset governance. They didn't say resigned. They said stepped down, which in corporate language is about 3 degrees colder than exile. The day he left, I watched from the far side of the lobby. No crowd, no applause, just Brandon, head low, sunglasses on indoors like a washed-up celebrity pretending he still had pull. He didn't carry anything out. His things had already been boxed by admin and delivered to his penthouse. The building didn't want a scene. The board even rerouted his parking access the night before, just in case he got any big ideas. The empire he thought he was born to lead had quietly erased him, line by line, and the man who made that possible? Miles never said a word. He didn't need to. A week later, during a shareholder Q&A at the annual Alaris Recap Summit, one of the institutional investors raised a hand. Can you confirm who architected the structural compliance terms that protected Alaris during the Hoyt Trust event? The GC nodded and lifted a thick, spiral-bound copy of the final merger contract onto the table. He flipped to the back, not the addenda, not the signature pages, the footnote. It was there. Clean, clinical, permanent. Addendum C-17 drafted and implemented under approval of Emser Renner, senior legal architect, to ensure compliance integrity during executive transition risk scenarios. The investor leaned back and smiled. That's all I needed to know. That line, one sentence buried below the margins, outlived Brandon's entire tenure. It didn't shout. It didn't threaten. It just sat there, like a landmine. And when the time was right, it rewrote the ending. Because in the end, Miles Renner didn't need revenge. He didn't need to be seen, celebrated, or even remembered. He just needed the clause to execute. And it did.